Hello, and thank you all for joining us today to discuss interview insights and tips. I'm Amy Goldstein, chair of the training programs for the Legal Mentor Network, and I'm also the founder of Grayson Allen, a recruiting and career coaching firm for attorneys. For those of you who might not be familiar, the Legal Mentor Network is a nonprofit organization focused on providing free legal mentoring to law students and junior attorneys. You can learn more not only about the organization, but also how to sign up as a mentee or a mentor at our website, legalmentornetwork.org. We are using the Q&A since this is a webinar format today. So first, we would like you to just enter whether you're a law student or a practicing attorney so we know who our audience is. And also feel free to put your questions in the Q&A as we go along. If it's appropriate, we'll answer them in a timely way during the presentation, but we also will be leaving 15 minutes for the end where we can answer any questions that are not directly related to the topic as they were going along. And also, we're going to be giving you an opportunity to sign up for a mock interview with one of our mentors. So definitely stick around and see how you can do that. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our moderator, Claudia Grillo, for introductions.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to the Legal Mentor Network for hosting this exciting webinar today. I'm Claudia Grillo. I'm the Director of Growth and Partnerships at FlowRecruit. Many of you may be using FlowRecruit throughout your interview process, as we are one of the go-to interview platforms for law schools as well as law firms. Prior to joining FlowRecruit, I was a legal recruiter for 2 years at Cardinal Search Partners in New York. And prior to that, I was head of the legal recruitment marketing team at Vault.com for over 13 years. So I have a lot of experience, whether it be reading associate comments and interview struggles firsthand or talking to students and prepping them throughout their interview process. So excited to bring that information to today's session and also hear from our expert panelists as well. So I'd love to have them introduce themselves. Jessica, I will kick it off with you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Spall-Rosen. I am a partner at Greenwald Dougherty, an employment law boutique firm. I'm sitting here in New York City today, but I'm licensed in multiple states and practice in multiple states, and started my practice in California at a bigger law firm and moved to New York about 10 and a half years ago. And in my role, I not only do interview attorneys and candidates, I also help companies navigate employment law issues around recruiting. And so I see kind of this issue from many different angles and see when it goes south and see some of the ways that that people get tripped up in the process. So I'm happy to bring my experience to talk about it today.
Great. Thanks, Jess. And Michael, how about you?
Thank you, Claudia, and good afternoon to everybody. So my name is Michael Tenenhouse. I am Manager of Professional Development at Cadwalder, where I work with the corporate group as well as the finance group, including real estate and fund finance. Prior to that, I worked at Brooklyn Law as a career coach for 6.5 years, and I ran their professional development programming and continue to be an adjunct professor there. I also worked as an associate at 2 big law firms for about 5 years, where I think I conducted over 100 OCI interviews. So I definitely have experience both prepping people for interviews and conducting them, and spent 2 years on Wall Street before law school.
Thank you. And Keith, last but not least.
Thank you, Claudia. I have a very similar background to Michael. I work at Brooklyn Law School currently as Associate Director of Career and Professional Development. And prior to joining Brooklyn Law School, I worked at Fried Frank and Davis & Gilbert for about roughly 5 years, where I was also involved heavily in the recruitment process on both the diversity committee and as an associate interviewing lateral associates as well as law students. And here at Brooklyn, a lot of what I do is prepping students for the job market, including interview prep, which I do a handful of every week. So I have a lot of experience with the interview process as well.
That's great. Thank you all. So everyone who's listening, I think you can feel confident that you are in good hands today with our diversity of experience coming forth. So what we're going to go through today as we go through interview insights, tips, and best practices are 3 parts, essentially. Thinking about how to prepare for your interview. We're also going to talk about actual interview questions and kind of guide you through the process of how to formulate and navigate those difficult, easy questions. And then also we're going to think about when your interview's over, does it just end or do you ask questions? And how do you frame those questions to keep the conversation going and highlight your interest to your interviewer. So first, let's talk about how to prepare. And something to think about as you're getting prepared for the interview is some of the things may feel little, some of the things may feel heavy and confusing, but no matter how little or big the prep is, you want to prepare. Going into an interview confidently is very important, but don't go in too confidently expecting that you don't have to prepare even for a screening interview. Especially when we think of today's landscape, there are different types of interviews that you do need to prepare for. Some will be in person, some will be virtual, and your full interview process may be a combination of both. So when you approach your preparation, you want to understand what is your interview format and how to prepare for that specific format, how to carry yourself with professionalism, what to wear, all of those really interesting things. So I want to pass it to Jessica. I would love to hear how you would advise a candidate on how to prepare to showcase their professionalism, what to wear, and how to navigate the various interview formats.
Sure. Like any good lawyer, I'm going to tell you it depends. Only half kidding. I mean, partially kidding because, there is a baseline, right? Like we're lawyers have a certain expectation culturally about how we dress. We'll just talk for a minute about dress, right? There's a certain expectation baseline about professionalism, wearing clean clothes that are pressed, tailored, something like that. But frankly, you really need to understand where you're going. Like if you're going to an entertainment law firm or even like a studio, if you show up in a black suit, you might stick out, right? Whereas if you're at a big law firm, that's going to be expected. So I think it's really stepping back and thinking about kind of who you're going to be meeting with and know who you're meeting with. And I think that'll probably ring through a lot of the comments we're going to make today is to know your audience and start from that. Who are you speaking to? What are their expectations? These days, there's a ton of information online that you're going to get. And I think rather than getting too mired in the details of like this versus that, I think if you zoom out and think about like, what are my goals here? What do I want to portray to my audience? And what do they care about? That's a great place to start. And I think a lot of the other details fall into place after that. And so one thing that I would want to express if I'm a candidate is warmth and confidence. I want people to know that I'm competent and confident and I can hold myself out, because in pretty much any legal job, you're going to need to speak and express yourself and advocate for yourself, right? You are an advocate for yourself and for your client. And second, you want to show that you're warm. You're someone that wants to get along well and play in the sandbox. So I think if you can kind of think thematically of what you want to portray and who your audience is, then the details around what to wear and those things I think fall into place if you do that research. I think the format is going to matter, right? It's very hard to create warmth on a Zoom. One thing I like to do is to talk while I smile, right? And to think about where my camera is placed when I'm doing that virtually. And just smiling changes the way people perceive you and hear you, right? So there's a little bit of a different dynamic when you're virtual versus in person. In person goes without saying, or virtually, don't be late, right? Show up on time. Don't show up 20 minutes before. These are busy people. If you get there, hang out downstairs, check in at reception 5 minutes before. We're not talking like sitting there awkwardly and keeping them waiting, because there's a little bit of balance, right? So kind of thinking through those details. And I think that's where you can really lean on mentors, other lawyers. Like even if you don't have a mentor, through the mentor network, any experienced lawyer is going to be willing to like give you a 3-minute email answer on like how to do this, right? So it's using your resources to kind of figure out in the situation that you're in, what makes the most sense.
Absolutely. That's great, Jessica. And also to that point, in terms of your resources and smiling, something that I would often do before prepping candidates for an interview was jump on a Zoom call with them before their interview to just smile for a few minutes and talk. So make sure you think about the resources that you have, whether you're lateral working with a recruiter or not working with a recruiter or a student who has friends or peers or family, that you can just say, hey, do you have 5 minutes to talk right before, a few minutes before, just to kind of get some of those jitters out and remind yourself to smile. And it could feel like you're exaggerating it, but in a Zoom call, it comes across very well. Awesome. So the next thing to think about in preparation is not just the format of the interview, but what should you prepare when you think about yourself? and your resume and communicating the most important pieces of your story in a compelling yet accurate fashion. And also thinking about, who am I interviewing with? How to research that firm, how to research that company, what are the key resources to go to understand who I'm talking to. So Michael, can you share a little bit of advice in framing that?
Sure, thank you. And I'm going to take that together. I'm going to first talk about really marketing yourself and how to market yourself as a package, and then two, where to look in preparation. But before I even go there, once you secure that interview, I want you to feel like you belong there. I know imposter syndrome is very real, but when you have that interview, you've already passed the qualifications. You're already qualified to be there. And now it's really yours to lose. And the focus really shifts now to, how you present yourself, how you communicate your qualifications, and if you're a culture fit for the company. So preparation is critical. And you're going to want to relate your experiences to the employer needs. I used to always tell my advisees, prepare for this like you're preparing for a final exam. Create an outline. And ultimately, you're going to need to market yourself. And what I would tell my advisors too is take a step back from the equation. Think of yourself as a consultant that got hired to market your resume to the job description. And you're going to want to build a personal brand around your work history. So what differentiates you? And this is something hard to really think about, and some people even feel uncomfortable doing this. So what I would tell people is do a 360-degree analysis. Ask your friends, your peers, your coworkers, your colleagues about, what is your X factor? What differentiates you? Because some people may see potential that you don't even see. So you're going to then want to develop a marketing strategy. Now, a lot of people would say, well, what if I was a teacher beforehand and now I'm interviewing for a legal job and I don't even have any legal internships yet? That's okay, because what you want to do is take a look at what your core competencies are. That would include your research skills, your writing skills, your communication skills, your time management, your organizational skills, and your work ethic. Those are my big core competencies. There are many others. So let's say you were a teacher. I mean, if you could command a classroom, you could command a boardroom one day, right? That's all about communication. It's about, if you could teach students, subject matters that might be difficult and break it down into easier parts, that's what you could do when you're preparing legal research. So another concern I hear a lot of is basically being uncomfortable selling yourself, right? But being extremely modest is not going to work either. There's a spectrum here. You want to strike a humble yet confident balance. So if you won some legal writing award, a Cali Award for legal writing, be proud of that and talk about how proud you are that your hard work paid off and let your enthusiasm shine through. You definitely want to know your employer's main practice areas. I was once conducting an interview. At one point, we were the only big firm, a previous firm that I was at, that was a pure play litigation firm. And the person I was interviewing wanted to do M&A, they told me. That person didn't advance to the next round. So you want to know, what practice areas your employer is top-notch at. And where do you find this information? So the website of the employer, start there, go to their practice area section, any recent articles, publications, the About Us section of the website, the career section of the website. The NALP has a great information, so go to the NALP form. That will tell you the number of attorneys, diversity statistics. Vault has great information. Chambers Associate is great, and there's a bonus tab on Chambers Associate where they usually have a Get Hired section, and they might even have an interview from the managing partner of the firm. Read that. Flow Recruit has great information, and there's a lot more out there.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. And something that I'm actually working on at Flow Recruit right now is our student platform, Flow Recruit Forward, which will also be for laterals in the future. But we are working on content on firms, thinking about asking firms to give advice to students as well. So it's also important to understand how firms are trying to communicate culture through marketing language and branding, but still trying to get the advice from them and learn, like Michael said, about the statistics and the demographics that really speak volumes about the firms themselves. Well, great. So let's move on as we feel confident and ready that we've prepared for the interview, keeping these things in mind. And let's go into now the actual interview and thinking about advice for the questions that you'll be receiving from your interviewers. And so when you're in the interview itself, you always want to think about the goal of the interviewers. And oftentimes they're asking themselves kind of 3 key questions. 1, can you do the work? Are you qualified for this role? 2, why are you interested in us? What makes our firm or this opportunity the right fit for you? And 3, do we get along? Will you add to the culture and the diversity of our team? Do we like you? So those are different things that will always be lingering in that interviewer's head and coming out through their targeted and pointed questions. So let's go through some of those commonly asked questions. Something so simple yet so challenging to understand where to start could be, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. So Keith, I'd love to hear from you. How would you start framing that answer to those questions?
Sure. So, I mean, the thing about preparing for interviews and taking interviews is that no 2 interviews are going to look the same, and that they're always going to change. You're always going to get different questions. You might get different questions firm to firm, person to person, or even the same person on different days might ask you different questions. So in terms of preparing for the interview, it's good to go through common interview questions, but since you never know what you're going to do, that can sometimes be difficult. But what we see and what I've seen traditionally is there's 2 questions that are asked in almost every interview, one of which is tell me about yourself / walk me through your resume. And then the next one is the next question, which I'll address, which is why do you want to work here? So tell me about yourself gives a lot of people consternation. And people, I hear all the time students say, I don't like this question. It's very open-ended. What do I talk about? I like this question, and it's asked so much because it's a really good chance for you to tell the interviewer what it is that you want them to know about you. So this question, you could answer this question in a lot of different ways, but in composing this answer, what I typically tell my students to do, what I do in my own tell me about yourself answer is I tell a narrative story. So I tell my narrative story from basically the beginning of college up until the point where I am now. And for lawyers or law students, that story will typically consist of something along the lines of, you know what, I'm from Long Island, I was born and raised in New York, and I always wanted to work in New York. When I went to college, this is my answer. When I went to college, I even knew I wanted to be a lawyer since I was a little kid. So I started as a pre-law major. And then after a year, I really liked it and switched my major to business administration because I wanted to have a diverse background. I knew I was going to go to law school. So in that answer, I told you, where did I come from? What did I do? And then in the narrative story, I want to hear something along the lines of what drove you to law school. So say you were a labor relations major in college and you learned about labor issues, and that's what triggered you to want to go to law school. You realized that a lot of the issues in labor relations have to do with the law and are touched by the law. So you thought, okay, this is something I really care about. I want to go to law school. And then you decide to go to law school, you apply to your law school, you got in, talk about the experience you had, the internships, all the different experiences you had along the way. So if you answer this as a narrative story, giving all of your relevant experiences and the things that you learned from them, that's a really effective answer. So when you're starting to think about this answer, just think about your life, your professional life, and what got you to this point. Now, how much detail you give in this answer will depend on how long the interview is. If it's a screener interview and it's 15 to 30 minutes, you might want to do a more concise, condensed version of this answer. And maybe skip out on some of the jobs, skip out on some of the details. But if you have an hour, maybe this answer could be a little bit longer. Think of a 3 to 4 minute version of this answer and about a 6 to 7 minute version, depending on how long you have for the interview. So think about this question as a really good opportunity. What is it about you that's special? What experience you have that's relevant? If the firm does a lot of litigation, if you work for a judge, you might want to talk about that. If the that the role is going to consist of, it's a capital markets role and your relevant accounting background would be helpful, talk about something like that. So really, this question really start to think about this question as a really good opportunity rather than a challenge, or rather than something that's gonna, tie your hands too much. So when you're thinking about this question, be broad, think about your story, and in general, when you're preparing for an interview, you should think about your story. Not quite on topic, but one thing to remember, since we're talking about the actual performance of the interview, remember that the best interview is a conversation. Like Claudia mentioned, those are the three things that they're looking for. Something very important is, your personality. Don't forget in all of these answers that there's always a little room for you to showcase your personality, because yes, if you got the interview, like Michael said, you're good enough, they would hire you. But show them in the interview why they should want to hire you. Are you personable? Are you fun? Do you have an interesting background? Do you have a lot to talk about? So really think about what you want to start thinking about in any interview question, but especially in the tell me about yourself. How are you going to use your answer to provide the information about yourself that you want these people to know? Over time, as you get more comfortable with interviews, you'll start to pick up on what each particular question is at, what they're looking for with each particular question. Tell me about X. But if they're asking you, tell me about X, they really want to know, all right, how do you handle a certain situation? What's your personality traits? What are your tendencies? So over time, you'll start to pick up on these things in interview questions. But the tell me about yourself is the easiest way to broadly tell them a lot of things. And then the next question that we usually see, tell me about yourself in a lot of interviews and why do you want to work here? These are, in my opinion, the two most common, the two most important questions. So tell me about yourself is introspective. You talk about what's special about you, what's unique about your background. Why do you want to work here is very specific on the employer, the person that the organization that you're interviewing with. So this is where your preparation and research is really going to come into play. So you want the employer to feel not just that you want a job, you want to be hired, but that you want to work for them because you know who they are and what they do. So for example, if you're interviewing with a Wall Street firm and you're really interested in corporate transactional law and working with private equity funds and their subsidiary companies, you could say, I'm very interested in your firm because you have these practices. I saw that you work with XYZ clients, and that's something that's really interesting to me. During my prior experience, during my internship, whatever it was, I got a little taste of this work and I really liked it and I wanted to learn more. Or, where I'm currently working at, I'm only getting exposure to XYZ areas of law and XYZ type of clients. I'm more interested in your firm and making the move to your firm because you have more of this type of work that I'm interested in. And in addition to that, I saw that your firm gives 20 hours a year of pro bono work that are creditable, that you can use as credit to hit your bonus. Pro bono is something that's very important to me. So that's something that I'm very interested in your firm about. And then besides that, I saw the professional development programs that your firm has. It's very important to me that not only am I practicing and getting good experience, but that there's programs in place to make sure that I'm progressing as a lawyer. So in that answer, I gave you 3 reasons, distinct reasons, but all those things were specific to the firm, and it was based upon my research that I did on the firm that I pulled out, and they'll know, okay, this person wants to work here. They want to do what we do, and they took the time to do the research and figure out who they are. And like Mike said, you could do it. There's a couple ways you can do the research to answer that question on their website. They'll provide a lot of good information. There's other good resources such as Chambers and Associate and Vault that'll give you a lot of information. And then a really good way to do this research, if possible, is to talk to people at the firm. If you have a friend, if you have someone within your network, give them a call. Be like, hey, Mike, I'm interviewing with Cadwalader. Do you have any inside information or tips? What I could focus on? What are important to things and what are the important things to the people of the firm? What's the culture like? I want to be able to discuss some of this in the interview. So really, really important that you prepare for every interview. You should prepare, but those are the 2 questions you're going to want to have down. Tell me about yourself. You'll get a standard answer that you might want to tweak specific experience and focus on specific experience based on who you're interviewing with. And then tell me why you want to work for this firm is going to change from interview to interview, and it absolutely should. And yeah, so those are the 2 specific questions you can prepare for. But in terms of preparing for the interview, find a list of commonly asked questions in legal interviews, and you could just run through those. And even if you don't have a rehearsed answer, if that doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for me. Some people don't like to focus on a specific answer because then you worry about it. And then if you don't have the right answer, you get worried. But try to think about what you would answer. So run through this. You can find these online. I'm sure that, if you want, you can reach out to me. I have one that's common questions for law students, but a lot of these things exist. So run through the list and start to think about what your answers would be. I can't guarantee what you're going to get in an interview, but if you've seen a question before and you've thought about the answer, it's going to be easier to answer it in the interview. So you look at a question like, oh, what is the most significant item on your resume? If you start to think about that beforehand, the second time that you answer it in an interview, it'll be a lot better than if you heard it for the first time. So just start to think about, just look at common questions and start to think about them. And then I'm going to turn it over because there's a couple, I think the next question is some more specific questions about practice and experience-related questions, which I believe Jess is going to take care of.
Sure, I'll hop to that then. So, I think in terms of questions, you're going to get questions about your practice, right? So either you're a law student, you're coming into your first job, or you're switching jobs. They're going to want to know about your interest in the law. And I think that, again, kind of if you take the approach of zooming out a little bit and thinking about kind of what do they care about, what do you care about, how can you make that match, then, then that's when you can get a little more specific. So ideally, if you have experience or you were in a summer intern somewhere and you can figure out a way to fit in that experience when you're talking about the practice to what the firm does or the organization where you're interviewing, that's ideal, right? And so even if there's not a direct correlation, you can find ways to extrapolate and say, this is how my experience is relevant to this. So it's, again, thinking like at that high level, being prepared with specifics, but thinking high level, like what do they care about? And that's where the research comes in. Just to add to what Keith said, also things like LinkedIn. Lawyers are increasingly more active on LinkedIn. I think depends on the industry, the firm they're at. But you can find individual lawyers speaking on LinkedIn. You can find a lot of knowledge that if it's at a firm, a lot of firms are putting out a ton of blogs and knowledge all the time. So you can see what the practice group that you're interviewing with is talking about. And then you can, again, then tailor what you've done or your interest to what they're talking about. And it just shows so much more interest on your part if you can really focus on like the work that they've done, which was not billable, to write up an article on some new case. Like if you can show that you read it and tie your experience in, I think that's very impactful. The one question that I think is incredibly important, and it's a skill that you need as a lawyer at any stage, is knowing how to answer a question that you don't know the answer to. So if you get a question about some technical area of the law, which someone might ask you, especially if you're lateraling in and you have experience, I think it's an art, not a science, and I'm sure every person has their own approach. Don't guess, don't give a wrong answer, right? They want to see how you act on the spot as lawyers. They know that you're going to have, just like when you study, you're in law school and you eventually practice, you're going to need to know how to use your resources to get the answer. And, obviously, if you're coming in at a senior level and you don't have basic information, like that might be very hard. But I think that knowing how to answer the question of not knowing the answer, I think is very important. So one thing you can say is, I think I know, I'm familiar with this. I've seen it before, but I don't want to guess. Let me get back to you. I'll follow up with you after with my thoughts on that, right? Like that's not ideal. Ideally, you know the answer, but you don't want to guess. That just does more harm than good. So I think, and again, if you can, again, pull it to that high level. And if it's a question and, hopefully people are not going to put you on the spot, like that's ideal. Like you don't really want to be put on the spot because again, in practice, you're not going to necessarily be on the spot, but some people might throw some hardballs at you. And so you need to kind of have a plan to address them. But if you do get asked a question about an area, and again, like pulling it into that, you may not have the direct experience, but I think Michael said this, like you're in the room, you're in there, you assume that you've got it and you're qualified. And so come from that place of confidence of, okay, yes, I've done this before, or I haven't written a motion for summary judgment, but I've helped to research the case law. So, I did it as part of a team, or I did this in my mock court, mock trials. So I think, again, kind of figuring out, the more you know about the practice in the firm, the easier it is for you to tailor your answers and get specific. And you got to think on your feet. That's, we're trained to do that. That's the good news. So I think it's really kind of developing those skills and where practicing with other people can really help as well.
Absolutely. And something too to think about as we talk about all these different questions, they really are a variation of the same questions to the core. And so when you think about, that tell me about yourself, walk me through your resume, you also want to keep in mind like 1 or 2 key examples that you can bring your resume to life through experience, like Jessica said, whether it was through your summer associate program or in your first or second, third year practicing. You want to think about one deal or one matter and be able to talk very smoothly about it so you can pivot to use that example in all of these different questions. The other thing that you want to be prepared for, the other types of topics, are behavioral interview questions. Now, this is coming up more and more frequently within legal interviews. And so there are a ton of different questions we can kind of go through as an example, but there is a key framework that many candidates use when approaching and tackling these behavioral interview questions, and that's called the STAR method. So I would love to hear from you, Michael, to kind of talk a little bit about the STAR method and how to create that basic framework.
Sure, thank you. And I left practicing in 2017 and became a career coach then. I would say the 2 biggest developments from an interview standpoint since 2017, 1, the rise of the virtual interview. Thank you, Claudia and Flow Recruit. And 2 is really the rise of these behavioral interview questions. We had a number of firms at the callback stage purely do behavioral interviewing for the entire interview for the callback stage. And one firm even said, we only want to hear about the STAR method in your answers. So I'm going to talk about the STAR method. So the concept of the behavioral interview question is that your past performance is the best predicator of your future performance in a similar situation. So how would you demonstrate that? Using the STAR method. You're going to want to write this down. STAR. The S and T go together. It's the situation or task. So you want to give a concrete, real example. You cannot just generalize, well, if I was in that situation, here's what I would do. They want to know, what have you done? So give a real concrete example, humanize it, give detail. A stands for action. That is the most important part of your answer here. What steps did you take in order to tackle that problem? And then R stands for result. It's what everybody forgets to do. Give the result, spin it in a positive light, and if you can, relate it to how it would better the employer. So I am happy to even, provide a STAR example. Claudia, do you have a question for me?
Yeah, absolutely. How about tell me about a time you were asked to research a topic that you knew nothing about?
Okay, so my summer associate experience, first week on the job, I get my first assignment. And the question was, I was working with the bankruptcy group, the restructuring group, was whether a particular type of trust called a rabbi trust was considered property of the estate under Section 541 of the Bankruptcy Code. Now, I took Bankruptcy 101. I had an understanding of what property of the estate was. I had no idea what this rabbi trust was and whether it's considered property of the estate in the Bankruptcy Code. So what I did, so now I'm giving you the situation task. I humanized it. I gave a detailed example. Now moving to A, action steps. Here's what I did. I knew that the Collier Treatise was the leading treatise in bankruptcy law. So I went to Section 541 of that leading treatise. I read about the legislative history, how it came about, what the code section is, what the meaning is, if there's any circuit splits. I read all about that. I had a very good understanding of property of the estate, and I happened to have actually found one reference to rabbi trust. I then went to Lexis, Westlaw, I did some research, shepherdized it, made sure it was still good law. At that point, writing the memo became pretty easy at that point. I got the memo into the partner, and with minimal edits, the partner got it over to the client. Now I'm giving the result, and I'm spinning it in a positive light. I'm confident if you guys were to give me an assignment where I don't really have a lot of background about the topic, I'm confident I could tackle that research. So that's how I would answer a behavioral interview question.
That's great. And that's a great framework to think about in all questions. Other examples, just things to think about. Tell me about a time you faced a challenge. Tell me about a time you've worked with a difficult or challenging personality. Tell me about a time you made a mistake and how you fixed it. So by using the STAR method, really frame these answers in such a strategic way that help you excel in that interview. Okay.
And one thing I would like to say about that last question, talking about a mistake, you'll be asked about negative things, and if you get asked about a mistake, or if you ever get asked about, you know, a weakness, you always want to think of an example that reflects you in the best light. So weakness should be a genuine weakness, but for a mistake, if you're gonna, for example selection, that's something that's very important with behavioral interview questions. You want to think about the example that best reflects you as a professional. So for mistake, don't use something that was a careless mistake. Use something that was a learning mistake, that you just didn't know any better. And from that mistake, you learned, and you won't make that type of mistake again. So it's okay to speak about things that are negative in your interview, but just make sure that if you have a mistake, if you have something negative, talk about how you're learning, how you learn from it, or how you're growing. That's very important.
That's a great point, Keith, and how that mistake was in the past and what you've done since then to prove that you're not making that mistake again. That's such a great point. Right. So we've gone through some really great questions. Thank you everyone for sharing and even answering some of those questions to give the candidates out there some actual tangible examples. And so now we've gone through the interview, the core questions that have been asked of you. Now you want to think about asking the questions back to your interviewer. So active listening, of course, is something to think about throughout your interview process. So as you're having this conversation, it's a two-way conversation. Has anything popped up that you haven't asked that was specific to what the interviewer has said, or even responding to questions now that were asked of you to elaborate on certain things? Those are always a great way to show that you've been actively listening, and to kind of ask some of those questions. But it is also important to think about some questions beforehand and have those prepared. And it is also okay if you ask the same question to different interviewers as well. So don't feel that you need to have 5 questions for one interview, 5 questions for another interviewer. It's okay to ask those same questions because everyone has a different perspective. And it's actually really helpful to get that different perspective from different attorneys. So I'd love to hear from the group of either some examples of questions that you've been asked before that have resonated with you, or just things that you look for when someone is in an interview that you'd love to be asked. So let's start with Jessica.
Sure. So I think first, when you think about asking, you need to have questions. Like that is table stakes. Do not omit this part of the preparation. It is important to have a question prepared, several questions prepared. Excuse me, and to think on your feet. So I wanted to zoom out for a quick second. Again, when you're thinking about those questions that you want to ask, that's again going to, I think of them as a combination of using it to get information, but to also show that you're informed, right? So you don't want to ask a question that, and I guess we're getting to questions not to ask, but you want to make sure that you're showing that you know what you're talking about and that you care. So I think one great question to ask is, what do the first 90 days look like for a successful candidate here, right? That shows that you are willing to come in, that you're willing to get started, like ready to go, raring to work hard. You want to know what success looks like. You want to hit those metrics. And, potentially if you're doing a series of interviews, that's a great question to get an answer to, and then use that to share when you're responding to other people's questions later, if you're doing another interview round, because the idea is that you're learning kind of like what their expectation is, what their need is right now. So I think that's a great kind of open-ended question that gives them a chance to say how you're going to meet their needs.
That's great. That's a great example. All right, Michael, do you have an example to share?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to actually give my home run example that I call it. And I provided this question to a lot of my advisees. One partner actually stopped an interview for one of my advisees and said, "That's a great question. I'm giving you an offer." It happened one time in 7 years, but this is my magic question. So I preface it with, the law is a knowledge business. And the more knowledge you have, the better of an attorney you're going to be. So how do you stay on top of the cutting edge changes? Let's say this is M&A law. In M&A law, what blogs do you read? What newsletters do you get? What publications do you read that allows you to stay on top of the market? Because if you guys give me this opportunity, I'm going to want to hit the ground running. And, that question demonstrates a lot of things, but back to Jessica's point, it shows eagerness. It shows that you want to get here and hit the ground running. So you could really use that for any kind of niche practice.
Absolutely. That is a great question. And Keith, how about you?
Well, Michael trained me so that I have the same home run question, but I'll use something different. So something I also counsel my students to do, if they can, is ask questions based on who the interviewer is and doing the research on that person. Jessica alluded to this. So, for example, when I was it's always good to ask questions that could get attorneys talking, because attorneys love to talk and they love to talk about what they do. So if you could ask them an intelligent, targeted question about their practice, that would be really good. So if I was interviewing with Jessica, I could ask her a question about, I saw the new pay transparency in New York is going to go statewide. How is that impacting your clients? Something like that. Or if you were interviewing me when I was at Free Frank, like, oh, Keith, I read your profile on the firm's website. I saw you did a Regulation A+ IPO. How is that different than a regular IPO? What was it like working with a movie theater company? Targeted questions. You could really get the attorney speaking. And people like, and I like it personally, when people took the effort to look into what I do. It doesn't have to, it should be professional in nature. You shouldn't be looking them up on Facebook and say, oh, hey, how was that vacation to the Dominican Republic with your kids? That looked fun. But it should be professional. And if you get someone talking about what they do and express an interest in what they're interested in, it endears you to people. So I think that those are good questions as well. That's, of course, if you know the identity of the person you're going to be interviewing with before the interview.
That's great. That's great. And to that point of researching who you're interviewing with and knowing their background, even understanding, were they hired to this firm as a lateral associate? Did they enter as a summer associate and come directly out of law school? That's really important. And you can note that and say, hey, I noticed you were homegrown. You started as a summer and you've been here for 15 years, or you moved from firm X to this firm before as a fourth year. Why did you choose this firm? That to me is also such a great question, because it's not going to just show that when you've done the research on them and you kind of known their path, but it's going to be so helpful for you to understand what they were evaluating when they made that decision to join this firm. So it's also going to equip you with a lot of really good information as you think about, is this a good fit for you as well?
Claudia, if I may, so at the very end of the interview, I've always noticed that there's a little awkward moment where an interviewer will say, do you have any additional questions? And let's say you really don't.
Right.
I've seen people say, nope, or no, I'm good, even worse.
Mm-hmm.
Wrap it up in a positive way. This has been a very informative interview. At this point, they don't have any additional questions, but after I was excited coming into this, even after meeting with you, I'm that much more excited about this potential opportunity, and I'd really love to join your team. Give them a little closing at that point.
That's great. And I'll just jump in. I think, to Claudia's point, it's again always about when you open your mouth, you're showing value, or even when you're not, you're smiling, you're engaged, right? Even if you're not talking, but it's, how do I show value? So it's not like just, why did you come here? You have to add the piece about the person. And I see that you were here since this and then, right? And really always kind of finding a way to just make it about give them a good feeling, that you want them to feel that you care about them and what they're doing. I'll just wrap up this section, because I know we're wrapping toward the end. Things you don't want to ask. Keith reference it. Don't ask. Don't go on Facebook. Don't like ask personal questions. That's obvious. And sometimes people mention personal things, and you can use your judgment about whether you want to ask further questions about that. I generally tend not to. And if you have a common background or grew up in the same city, like, yes, sure, connect with people personally, but don't ask probing questions about personal life. You want to also, again, going to the place of being prepared. You want to be educated on the person. You don't want to ask questions that are basic. What's the billable requirement? What's the salary? Like that information should be available. You should be aware of it. And frankly, asking about billable hours, like, that's just very off-putting anyway. You have to be really careful. You want to show that you're a hard worker, that you're going to do what it takes to get done, and not make them question it. And to that end, again, you don't want to necessarily come in and start asking about promotional opportunities or like how can I go from litigation to corporate? Because I really want to do corporate, but you only have a litigation opening, right? You have to be show them that you care about this role and that your job is going to be to come in and help them, because you essentially they're looking to you as a resource, and you want to show them in everything you do in the interview that you're on it and you're going to be reliable and you're going to address their needs and you're going to make their life easier. Like that's what they really care about at the end of the day. So I think when you don't want to ask things that make people question that you're really committed to the role.
Absolutely. Those are great things to keep in mind. And including that you don't have to ask if it's okay that you're taking a vacation that you have planned in 3 months from now either. These are things that can come up once an offer is made that you can discuss and keep in mind in the negotiation process, or always something you want to be transparent about before accepting an offer, but it doesn't need to come up in the interview itself. Well, that's great. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been amazing. We've outlined a lot of questions for you, but we'd love to hear your questions. So please feel free to write into the chat. We have about 10 minutes left, which we've left to answer any questions specifically that you have. So please, we'll give you a minute or so to write in. Hope you've been actively listening to think about certain things to target to us.
In the meantime, I guess the question I have for the folks, especially the advisors, what are common questions that people have about interviewing that we haven't covered?
Yeah, I get a lot. I get the question, I don't know how to answer, tell me about yourself. I see that question a lot. I see students, looks like the chat is disabled, someone said.
Thank you for letting us know. Amy, can you?
You want to ask a question in the Q&A function.
Sorry, yes, in the Q&A. Sorry, I keep saying the chat specifically.
That the person wrote that the chat is disabled, so don't use the chat. Just use the Q&A if you have a question, and that clearly works because someone had that question.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Jess.
Yeah, besides that, students, sometimes, well, a lot of what students have concerns with is, their grades. If they don't have the best grades, they'll ask, how could I address that in an interview? And I always tell them that, even if you don't have the best grades, there's other things you could focus on. And the way I typically they see the question asked is, do you think your grades are a good reflection of your potential? And if my students, they got a rough start or they had a rough period in law school, I always tell them that you could say, no, I think that my grades aren't a good reflection of my potential, but there's other things about me that you can consider. Look at my work experience. I've always gotten positive feedback on my work product and my work assignments, so I know I've worked at 2 or 3 law firms in internships. I know that I can do the work. Yeah, it's never worked out. And, my grades aren't where I would like them to be, and I continue to work hard in class every single semester to get my grades up. But I think what's a better reflection of me is what I've achieved in the workplace. So there's always ways to address questions like that. And yeah, those are really the common ones. So tell me about yourself. It's hard for people. Addressing negative things is tough. Yeah, so advice for LLM grads. Yeah, I'm actually the dedicated LLM counselor at Brooklyn Law School. And I think that a lot of LLMs, I don't know if I'll address this. I don't know if you mean LLMs meaning foreign trained lawyers or LLMs like with an LLM in tax or something like that. It's typically for the former. So I'll address that. So if you were a lawyer in a foreign country and came here to get your LLM to practice in the United States, you had experience practicing law. So when you interview and when you're writing cover letters, focus on the experience that you have practicing law. It may have been a different legal system, maybe not. Maybe you're from a country like England or Jamaica where they follow the common law system. Focus on all the things that you've done in the past. You had good experience, and all the skills that you have you'll be able to translate those skills to working in the U.S. I mean, organization, research, attention to detail, communication, client service. Focus on those same skills. I think they're going to be relevant no matter where you got them from.
That's great. Thanks, Keith. There's another question that came through the Q&A asking, how should we address any gaps in skills or knowledge that the job description may require?
That's a great question, and it's very similar to the question Keith put forth before about a lower GPA. Well, first off, if you do have any gap in a skill or knowledge in the job description, don't bring it up, right? So let's assume that you're saying that they are bringing it up in the interview. Then you could acknowledge it, just like Keith acknowledge the GPA, but then pivot. But here's what I bring to the table. And that's where you could start rattling off some of your talking points and your core competencies that might relate to this, but may be a little bit different than the actual requirement they're talking about.
And I think if you have, there's an area that maybe you just haven't had substantive knowledge in that area because it hasn't come up in your practice, I think you can also say things like, that's something that I've actually been looking at, and I've been actively researching it, or I'm looking to grow in this area. I've identified some of my upcoming conferences that I plan to go to. Like, making it about your desire to learn, I think shows that you are committed. And because look, you're not always going to have every single experience that is relevant to the role. And a lot of people make the mistake of like not applying for jobs if they don't have 10 of 10. Don't do that. Like, take a stretch. And like Michael said, advocate for yourself. Don't draw attention to your weaknesses. But, the way you can turn in that experience. So like, I'm actively looking and I've researched it. I want to, privacy law, like I've been studying for the exam. I've taken courses, like whatever you can do to show that you care and that you're planning to do it because you know that it's required. It shows that you actually understand the role and that you have that learning mindset, which is what someone really cares about more than anything.
Absolutely. That demonstrated interest is key. All right. Another question. Thank you. These are great questions. How would you answer this in an interview? How do you typically stay informed about changes in relevant laws and regulations? And how do you ensure compliance with these changes in your current or previous roles? Anyone want to take a stab at that? At least a framework to think about?
Yeah, I mean, this is very, very specific, and
Right.
whoever's asking the question, I don't know what your current experience is or your prior role, so it's tough to answer. But the first part of it, how do you typically stay informed about changes in relevant laws and regulations? You're going to want to talk about the materials and publications you read. So maybe you read the Wall Street Journal, maybe you read the Money and Investing section of the Wall Street Journal, maybe you get Law 360 in a certain subgroup within Law 360, and you read about compliance or regulation changes. I can't really answer. You don't want to lie or make up what you what you should be doing, but you're going to want to talk about what you actually do read.
And if you're a law student, I'm just jumping on that. If you're a law student, right, it's going to be different. You're a little bit more kind of out there reading things like, old case law from whatever 200 years ago. But in all honesty, I mean, I think it's thinking about, as you prepare for the interview, you're going to want to do some research on the industry. If it's an M&A job, right? If it's an employment law job, and understand what practitioners are looking at, reading, and kind of what some of those resources are. So I think that kind of comes to your preparation. And, I think again, that question goes to your curiosity and willingness to marshal your resources. And so even if you don't know a publication or a journal, you can say, I would always research it. I would ask my colleagues, I would ask my mentors in the firm, I would draw the resources, I would go to the library or whatever. Now that, I would call on some law firms that might still have libraries or have at least librarians or resource people, knowledge management people, right? And so I would go to the people in my resource in the firm and outside the firm to understand these things. And, if you're first starting out, you're going to ask your mentors, right? So it's being honest about kind of using your resources to get the right information and to not kind of go into a corner and hide.
That's great. Now we have another question that's targeted more to a JD MBA. Can one of you speak to how employers, especially big law firms, may view someone working on a JD MBA dual degree, or even what types of questions may be different that would come up targeted to a JD MBA?
Yeah, I mean, I know Michael's given programs and, using your MBA on Wall Street, using your JD on Wall Street, so he could approach it from that perspective, but it's always viewed positively. And I practice capital markets and mergers and acquisition. So that what you would learn in an MBA would be very relevant because there's a lot of accounting in those practices. Capital markets is the practice of basically turning financial information into disclosure for public companies. It's a lot of what we do. With M&A, there's a lot of complex accounting that goes into the way deals are structured sometimes. So the MBA is going to be very helpful. If you could have a good understanding of accounting and how business works, that's going to be very helpful, especially at big firms, because big firms do a lot of things. A lot of what they do is corporate law. So anything from M&A, finance, capital markets, asset management, having that MBA is going to be very helpful. So I think that they view it positively. So if you're considering doing it, it's typically helpful, but then having the MBA also helps you if you want to go in a different direction with your career. So you have that law background, you have that law training, but then also having the MBA really does nothing but open doors for you.
Absolutely.
I would just add, it's not just about having an MBA, but if you were a finance major in undergrad or an accounting major in undergrad, and these are not prerequisites by any means, but if you do have this experience, I would definitely play it up on an interview. I tell people if they were an accountant or they have an accounting degree, talk about it in these terms. Accounting is the language of business. And it will definitely come in handy. I mean, if somebody doesn't know the difference between a stock and bond, and they get a very detailed research assignment about a collateralized debt obligation gone wrong, there's going to be a steeper learning curve versus somebody that can speak the language of finance or accounting.
Great. Now we have about 2 minutes left, I think, for one final question that's come up in the Q&A from a foreign lawyer who is now currently getting their LLM. And they are asking, do we have any recommendations of volunteer opportunities or experience that they can participate in that would help build up their resume when transitioning to U.S. practice? I think it's a great question to think that you are thinking of opportunities outside the box. And a lot of it, I think, goes to some of the resources and research that we've talked about. And it looks like a few people came off mute. Do you want to jump in?
Well, I know, I think Keith said he's the LLM mentor. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, or Michael unmuted. That's fine.
Yeah, I would just say get in touch with your law school, and they could often put you in the right direction of pro bono opportunities, volunteer opportunities. There are a ton of them. There are clinics you could get engaged with as well when you're actually at law school, and then get in touch with your local city bar. The city bar associations often have terrific pro bono and volunteer opportunities too.
And that's such a great point to potentially end on, is getting in touch with your law school, regardless of how long you've been out of law school. If you're in law school, if you're getting your LLM, your career service office and your alumni office is still there to help you and to support you. So oftentimes you forget about that. So don't forget about those helpful resources that you have at your fingertips.
That is the perfect wrap. Claudia, Jess, Keith, Michael, thank you so much. I was scribbling notes the entire time and plan to lift some of the language that you used as I prep people for their interview. So thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you would like to sign up for a mock interview, you can message us through the Legal Mentor Network page on LinkedIn, and we will get back to you and match you with a mentor. We have upcoming programs on May 2nd on relationship building. So if you need help, which we all always do, with ideas for networking and how to get out there, whatever you're interested in pursuing, join us on May 2nd. And then on June 6th, we will have a presentation with Rich Bracken on executive presence, also not to be missed. So again, thank you everyone. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Amy.